Do we have Narae in the room?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Narae. Am I pronouncing your name correctly?
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. I suggest we just get started since it's right at 2:45 and
Sure.
people seem to be joining at a rapid pace. I'm really looking forward to your session on where we are matters. And so please turn it over to Narae Lee, who is a PhD candidate at the Carlson School of Management at the University of Minnesota. Feel free to start sharing your screen and we look forward to your presentation.
Sure. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. My name is Narae Lee. I'm a PhD candidate from the Carlson School of Management at the University of Minnesota, and will be joining the faculty of the Singapore Management University as an assistant professor this coming fall. I'm really glad about this opportunity to talk about my research in front of such a diverse audience. So I'm looking forward to your comments and questions about my paper to improve my paper. So the paper that I'm presenting today is Where We Are From Matters. So this paper explores the relationship between local immigrant populations and firm environmental performance. But before I proceed, I first want to briefly talk about my broad research interest to help you understand where my paper is coming from. So I'm interested in contingencies that make sustainability pressures less effective. So how do they lead to unintended and even less desirable environmental outcome? So in this context, I have been looking at two important sustainability pressures, local community and environmental regulations, that we traditionally believe to be very effective in pushing firms toward more sustainable practices. And the paper that I'm presenting today belongs to the first pillar of local community, as it is looking at how changing demographic characteristics of local populations is related with firm environmental pollution. And although I'm going to focus on this particular paper today, I'm more than happy to talk about my other papers at the end of the presentation or even offline. Then let's move to my paper, Where We Are From Matters, Assessing the Impact of Immigrants on Farm Environmental Performance. So among various characteristics, demographic characteristics that can define local populations, I'm focusing on increasing immigrant populations here because they have become an important source of social changes and some challenges, not only in the US, but all over the world. So there is some growing interest in immigration by management scholars. So they have looked at how immigrants affect local labor market and how they influence the process of job creation and innovation. And as you can recall, David Card, an economist who's studying immigrants, received Nobel Prize last year. But there is also a concern that we still acknowledge on how immigrants is associated with other societal implications, such as farm environmental pollution. So in this paper, I'm asking, how do immigrants in local populations affect firms' sustainability practices? And throughout the paper, I define immigrants as all foreign-born populations. So to give you some preview in the theory, I predict that the immigrant populations negatively affect firm environmental performance. In other words, when there are more immigrants in local populations, a firm tends to increase its environmental pollution. And here is why. So local population, general local populations and environmental NGOs and local community are secondary stakeholders. So unlike the primary stakeholders such as investors and suppliers was briefly mentioned in the previous presentation, are the primary stakeholders who have direct business relationship with firms. And these local populations do not have such relationship. And unlike the prosecutors or regulators, they do not have strong enforcement tool either. But still, they're very influential because they can employ various tactics to influence firms' practices. So for example, they can directly disrupt firm operations through boycott and protest, And they can also indirectly do so by influencing regulatory activities and partaking in policymaking processes. And when doing so, they want to engage more broader local populations for better outcomes, to gain more media attention and to legitimize the issues. But not all of these collective pressures are successful because group heterogeneity can negatively affect effective collective pressures. So the seminal paper by Putnam finds that in a highly heterogeneous community, people exert lower level of trust at individual level, and that is transformed into lower social capital at community level. And when the society consists of loosely connected subnetworks, people also become less susceptible to community level normative pressures. And we know that cultural and language barriers can increase the cost to coordinate different activities. And it is also possible that immigrants may have other priorities. I'm not saying that immigrants are not concerned about environmental pollution, because they should be, as pollution that can negatively affect your wealth and health. But given that adjusting to a new country is expensive, they may want to focus on educating their children or looking for a job instead of participating in collective sustainability pressures. But given that the benefits of such pressures, collective pressures, such as clean air, is non-excludable, other people may consider immigrants as free rider and reduce their commitment, their own commitment to organizing collective pressures. So in this context, firms would exploit lower level of social pressures on environmental sustainability because doing so is cheaper. So for the baseline hypothesis, I expect a facility's environmental performance would decline as the local immigrant population increases. And as I base my argument on heterogeneity among local populations, in this second hypothesis, I'm looking at the diversity among immigrants themselves. So immigrants these days are coming from all over the world with different cultural and ethnic backgrounds, especially in the US. And some of them may be often in the complex relationship due to the history between their home countries and even refuse to interact with each other. And that would further reduce the cohesiveness of the local populations. So I predict the greater heterogeneity among immigrants is, the stronger the relationship in the baseline hypothesis would become. And so far, I was talking about externally driven pressures as source of the environmental sustainable environmental practices. And management scholars have also found that intrinsic motivation of individual decision makers also affect firms' environmental performance, such as managers' ethical value, political ideology, and homophily. So for homophily, people receive higher emotional gains when their action benefits someone similar. So empirically, management scholars have found that multinational companies tend to spend more resources in CSR when there exist high cultural and ethnic similarities between their home countries and their host countries. And in the context of my research, I'm looking at the co-nationality link between local immigrant populations and the subsidiary of multinational companies. So people coming from the same home country most likely look similar, and they speak the same language, and they share the same culture. So this decision maker of multinational companies would receive higher emotional gains when their actions benefits the local population, local immigrant populations, especially those coming from the same home country. And this would negatively mitigate the externally driven incentives to exploit lower external pressures. So in my final hypothesis, I predict that for a foreign-owned facility, the relationship in H1 would weaken as the co-national immigrant increases. And this is the summary of my three hypotheses. A facility's environmental performance would decline as there are more immigrants in local populations, and this relationship becomes stronger as there is a higher heterogeneity among immigrants. But for a foreign-owned facility, the relationship in H1 weakens as the co-national immigrant increases. And moving to a methodology. So I believe some of you are familiar with EPA's toxic release inventory, which records facility level environmental pollution. So I mainly use that data to construct my final sample. And I merged this EPA facility level data with Dun & Bradstreet database to gain a facility and owner level business information. And I also refer to PitchBook, news articles, and other press releases to track down the ownership changes. And I finally merged this facility level data with Census American Community Survey for local immigrant populations. So finally, I have about 12,000 US manufacturing facilities in my final sample that covered from 2010 to 2018. So this is basically the OLS regression model that I estimate with my data. So how the change in local immigrant population would be related with a facility's environmental performance, measured as the natural log of toxic waste releases. So that means higher releases is worse environmental performance. So if I see positive and significant sign for my main variable immigrants, then that would support my hypothesis. And of course, I include control variables at various levels: facility level, owner level, and local state level, and also at the country level. And also to control unobservable facility and owner level characteristics, I include facility fixed defect and also year fixed defect. So ideally, to find this causal relationship between local immigrant population and farm environmental performance, I would randomly allocate immigrants into each local state and see how that would affect facilities' environmental performance operating in that particular state. But that is not possible. So I have to rely on my OLS regression model. But then the concern is there might be some unobservable macro level factors that simultaneously affect immigrant location decision and facilities environmental performance. So in this paper, to address this concern, I used the technique called 2SLS, two-stage least square model, where I use refugee capacity as an instrument. So instrument should be able to predict my main variable, which is local immigrant population, but should not be directly related with my dependent variable, which is farm environmental performance. And to give you some institutional background of refugee capacity, so each year the U.S. president set the ceilings of the total number of refugees that can be admitted into the U.S. territory, and a consortium of federal government agencies allocate this number into each U.S. state, considering the factors that do not seem to be directly related with facilities' environmental performance, such as English lessons and medical services. So I use this instrument to predict this instrument can predict the actual settlement of refugees, which is part of the local immigrant populations. And then before showing you the regression results, I first want to give you some graphical evidence to support my hypothesis. So this graph is to see the relationship between the change in immigrants ratio in local populations and the percentage change of facilities toxic per sales. And you can see that there is overall positive relationship between these two, giving me some initial support for the main hypothesis. And these are the regression results. So I'm showing you different models, but for now, I'm gonna focus on the model 3, OLS model where I use all level control variables. So as you can see, the main explanatory variable, immigrants, has positive and significant coefficient. So meaning that an increase of immigrants is associated with a facility increasing its toxic pollution. And as you can see, the results is consistent in 2 SLS model as well. So this gives me support for the H1, that a facility's environmental performance declines as the local immigrant population increases. And the H2 is to test whether this relationship is more pronounced when there exists higher heterogeneity among immigrants. So to test H2, I first created heterogeneity measure by referring to the logic in the Herfindahl index. So I squared the ratio of immigrants from each home country and sum the resulting numbers. So higher score means lower heterogeneity. And as you can see, there is clearly a more positive relationship between the change in immigrant ratio and percentage change in facilities toxic per sale when there exists higher heterogeneity among immigrant population than when it is not. And these are the regression results. As you can see from the OLS model, the coefficient of immigrant is positive and significant only when there exists higher heterogeneity among immigrant populations. And this relationship holds for 2 SLS model as well. So these results collectively give me the support for H2, that the greater heterogeneity among immigrants is, the stronger the relationship in H1 becomes. And then the H3 was about the effect of homophily, an effect about the home country immigrants. And I will explain briefly how I constructed this measure, home and other country immigrants. So as an example, this is a Hyundai Motor facility operating in Alabama. And the president of this facility is Young-Duk Lim, also from South Korea. So to this president and to this facility, the home country immigrants are those Korean immigrants living in Alabama, and the other immigrants are the rest of the immigrants in Alabama. And I expect there is strong co-nationality link between a facility's decision maker and immigrants from the same home country. So to repeat the same procedure, I want to show that there is clearly negative relationship between the change of home immigrant ratio and the percentage change of toxic releases of facility from a foreign country, while the relationship between the other immigrant ratio and the toxic per sales has slightly positive relationship. And this is the regression results. As you can see, home immigrants has negative and positive coefficient, while other immigrant the home immigrants is negative and significant relationship, while other immigrants is significant but positive relationship. So the relationship in H1 weakens for foreign-owned facility as there are more immigrants from the same home country as the focal facility's owner. So receiving support for my main hypothesis, I ran a bunch of supplementary analysis to look for the mechanism and also for more robust results. And because I have some time limits, I'm not going to go through all the supplementary analysis, but I'm gonna talk about the first. What are the specific mechanisms? First, okay, so in the TRA structure, the EPA requires the facilities to report how much chemical waste they finally release into the surrounding environment, but also how many chemical waste are treated before they are being released into the surrounding environment. And this treatment processes is costly, but can certainly reduce toxic releases. So using that information, I created a new dependent variable, how much toxic waste are treated compared to how much waste are firstly generated. And as you can see, the coefficient of immigrants is negative and positive, meaning that an increase of immigrants is negatively associated with facilities engaged in waste treatment processes. So when there are more immigrants in local population, a facility tend to decrease their efforts and decrease their resources to treat chemical waste before they release them into the surrounding environment. And this relationship becomes more pronounced when immigrant heterogeneity is high, but becomes weaker with increasing home country immigrants when it comes to a foreign-owned facility. So this is consistent with the story that I just showed you in the previous slide. And another mechanism is EPA corrective actions. So EPA corrective actions include inspection, the facility inspection by the EPA, and warning letter and financial penalty. And as you can see, when I'm controlling the past EPA actions and also past releases at a facility level, the coefficient of immigrants is negative and significant, meaning that an increase of immigrants is negatively associated with facilities receiving EPA corrective actions. And that is more pronounced when immigrant heterogeneity is high, also consistent with the previous story. So it suggests that when there are more immigrants, an EPA officer may be under less pressure to scrutinize polluting facilities in the local community. So that can explain the mechanism that we just saw. And I think that you may be interested in this question, whether state is a right administrative unit. So I chose a state in my paper because doing so, I can have the most observation. I don't need to drop the observations and the number of, I can contain the most number of facilities in my sample. And also many of the NGOs organize their activities at a state level because they want to press the state level politicians to make the more environmentally sustainable regulation and policies. And I also find that even though you live as far as far away from about 1,000 kilometers away from the polluting source, you would still be affected by pollutants, as you can see from this graph. But still, for this concern that state might be a too broad administrative unit to define a local populations, in the supplementary analysis, I only include those facilities that are operating in metro and micropolitan areas. And as you can see, the results are consistent. And then maybe I will talk about the last before I move to the conclusion. So as you can see, the coefficient of immigrants is 0.01. So that means that an increase of 10,000 immigrants is associated with 1% increase of toxic emissions. And for the sample facilities in my data, that corresponds to 400 pounds of more toxic chemicals. And is it too small? So in the context of Minnesota, that is, we had 12,000 more immigrants in the state of Minnesota over 2017 and 2018. And on average, that is about 120,000 more pounds of toxic pollutants for the residents living in Minnesota. And this is quite concerning because the TRI chemicals are not just regular chemicals, but only they include only those that cause serious health problem on human body. And I also found this research saying that there is no threshold for the pollutants, and actually they are proportionally more toxic at the lowest level of exposure. So we need to achieve near zero exposures to protect the public health. So with that, I will move to the conclusion. So these are the main takeaways from my paper. So increasing local immigrant populations leads to an increase of toxic chemical releases from a facility. And it's because more heterogeneous community becomes less cohesive in mobilizing collective sustainability pressures. But increasing co-national immigrant population leads to a decrease of toxic chemical releases when it comes to a foreign-owned facility. And it is because homophily negatively influences the impact of external pressures. So this is a joint interaction between external pressures and intrinsic motivation. So this paper addresses important gaps in current management research from environmental sustainability literature and also in immigration literature. And I think these findings also have some important policy implications. First, we need to take more comprehensive approach in dealing with current issues. So my paper suggests that biases against immigrants may have unintended environmental implications because that would negatively affect the pressures, the local population's capability to organize effective sustainability pressures. And this paper also shows that local pressures, local non-regulatory pressures can be limited. And when that happens, it is those who are marginalized population who would be affected the most. So we need to protect this marginalized population with more strong regulations. So with that, I end my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to questions and any comments. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Questions, comments, very, different takes on different issues. So I'm really glad that you're able to present your thoughts. And I definitely think, in places where people aren't as forthcoming, how do we think about regulation as a way to approach the issue from a different way? So I really appreciated that point as well. Any questions or comments in the chat? Or feel free to shout them out. I know it's a lot to take in, but certainly very interesting points.
Well, I'm also on LinkedIn, and my email was on the last slide. So please feel free to email me or message me on the LinkedIn if you have any further question, not only this paper, but my other papers that I briefly showed in the very first slide. And again, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Narae. We really appreciated your perspective. We'll be heading to the next session immediately after this one. So thank you so much.